Hi guys, it's Chess Learning for Life here with our second video of the channel. So today we'll be teaching about the French defense. And for you audiences, a very good opening learner for me is the website Chessbook. So for Chessbook, if you would pay for $8 per month, is very cheap, but it lets you add your whole repertoire. You can add like maybe the Queen's Gambit, French Defense, Nimzo, Indian, whatsoever. You can add your repertoire here, and then you could practice those moves, which helps your memorization. Play through a model game, which you could see how the higher rated players and like the grandmasters would play your opening repertoire and their middle game ideas and end game ideas. You could correct your mistakes from chess.com and Lichess, and you could have some insights. And although I don't pay for it, but these usage really helps with learning openings. But back to the main point, the French defense. We'll use the chess.com stockfish analysis for this. And the French defense is basically the opening after e4 and e6. This is the French defense. And the main move for white is d4 here, and this is met with the d5. And this shows the idea of why you would push for e6 at the first place. It is to support this d5 pawn push, and unlike maybe the Caro-Kann where you push for c6, this time you protect it with the e pawn. So today we'll talk about the three main moves and some sidelines. So the three main responses from white is captures, the exchange variation, e5, the advanced variation, and knight c3, called the normal variation. So firstly, the most common move is the exchange, where after the exchange the whole position is symmetrical. You can basically be a copycat and do everything white does. A pin, and then a main idea for the exchange variation is to protect the d pawn with the c pawn, c3, because like maybe I play some random moves, like you see this is a threat. Because of this pin, this pawn is very weak. So a main idea for both sides is c3 and c6 to protect this d4 d5 pawn, because there is already a bishop in this diagonal, and therefore you want the pawns to belong to the light squares to balance out the colors. So yep, this is basically like the copycat variation. Like everything just goes the same, like c6, and then just supporting this knight. So this just, as you can see for the engine, it's 0.01 and 00. Yeah, 00. So this line of the French defense is very good for draws, and at like the intermediate level, you might still want to play for some tactics and end games, but if you want to climb the rating for the higher levels, or for tournament playings and you want a quick easy draw, French defense is very good because it's solid, and there's this copycat variation for the exchange variation. But maybe you played the French defense to try and catch your opponent off guard. But if your opponent plays the exchange variation, it's pretty hard to create an imbalance. So in this position, what you want to play is to play c5 if you want to create an imbalance. So some main moves are a queen check to force your bishop block to then take your pawn. But after castling, you can't really defend this. You can, but the queen stays here, and even if you castle, this bishop is pinned. So you can always get back this pawn. Maybe, for example, like b4, because this file is too strong, and if you castle, there's discovery attacks, so you don't need to worry about queen e2 check. There is castles, which is met with c4. And when the bishop goes back, there's knight d6, knight c6, and bishop d6, excuse me. Bishop d6 just allows for a quick castling. So, and then there's c3, which could also be met with c4, and then a bishop d6 with a quick castle. And your main idea is to break this pawn chain with the b5 b4 push in the queen side, and if you take down here after the knight develops, this is a very big weakness. You can reroute the bishop. You can reroute the bishop to attack it. You can hop the knight to attack it. You can have the queen to attack it. So these are some middle game ideas, but one thing you want to prevent is maybe in some lines this battery. So a very prophylactic move is for both sides is h3 and h6. White may play like rook e1 here, and bishop g4 is also a idea because the bishop left this diagonal and is no longer able to unpin. And therefore, white will also like to pin this knight, but both could like protect it and then move the queen away to unpin itself. This is just a very complicated, but as you could see, the engine likes the black's position slightly better. So therefore, I really recommend this c5 move if you would like to play a more dynamic position after the exchange variation. So for the next response, it's the e5 advanced variation. So for this variation, the move must be c5. You have to break this pawn chain. This d4 and e5 supporting pawns, and white most of the time would respond with c3, and then knight c6, getting one more attacker on this d4 pawn, knight f3, and then in this position there is many moves. As you can see, there's knight ge7, queen b6, but one move I prefer, and I really like to bring it out to you guys, is this bishop d7, the Yue, maybe it's called Yue variation, the Yue variation. Nice, guys. So this move, because it gives a trap like if the opponent plays bishop e5, you can knight takes e5 here, just wins a pawn. If knight takes, then bishop takes bishop. Bishop takes bishop, you can take back with the knight to save your knight. And then if pawn takes, it's just also taking the bishop. So this wins a pawn. So why I don't like knight g7, I don't know, I don't prefer this because I don't really like to put the knight on g6 because of some bishop d3, and then after castling you'll see later those ideas. So I like to get my bishop here first to prevent this pin. And main moves are bishop e2 and bishop d3. So let's look at bishop d3. So for this, I'll take c takes d4, and if the knight takes, this pawn hangs. So you have to take with the white has to take with the c pawn, and here comes queen b6. So remember, the queen b6 idea is very often good for the French defense, and in the contrary, queen b3 is also strong in the Queen's Gambit, which I will talk about in the later videos, because Queen's Gambit is also one of my, it is the main repertoire for my opening repertoire for the white pieces for me. So for here, there's this move bishop c2, and just simply giving away the bishop pair like this, and this is just advantageous for black. And then there's this just bishop dropping back, like, and then a common idea is you want to get the knight g to e7, and then you like to hop it to f5. So like there are two main ideas. One is knight g6, which is just depressing. For some lines you have to go to g6 because of the bishop on d3, but just the knight hopping to c5, and then yes, just getting another attacker on this d4 pawn. So it's just the French defense, it's playing on this d4 pawn. Just some ideas here, just playing the top engine lines, but this is the ideas after bishop d3. Flying the queen out to b6 is very strong. So another move is bishop e2, which is as you can see slightly preferred better by the engine, which I would play knight g to e7, and after castles it's takes and knight f5 again. You see, so the French defense, you don't really need to memorize the lines. It's just these ideas: knight g e7, knight f5, knight g6, and then queen b6. It's just, you need to remember these ideas, and like attacking this d4 pawn. And so game goes on here. I'll just play some moves like this. Maybe flying the queen out to b6 would be met with knight a4. So you need to be careful for when your queen flies out, will it be met with knight a4? So it proves how bishop d7 will work, because later if the knight moves out, it would target this square. just talking about some ideas. And bishop d3 is awkward. Wait. Oh, bishop d3. Yes. Oops, sorry guys. Oh, wait, there we go. So bishop d3 is retargeting this knight and trying to trade it off. So maybe a random move. Trade it off, and doubling is not good. Remember, although you have the bishop pair, doubling is not good in this opening. So the engine says castle takes. I don't really play against players that would play bishop d3 in this position, but so therefore the engine prefers a6 for some reason. Wait, this pawn is hanging. But it's met with queen g4. So I'm also learning something here, guys. So how does a6 here affect anything? Now queen g4 doesn't work because of knight c6. Yeah, because the bishop is still here. So a6, bishop. You can't develop the bishop here because the pawn just hangs, so yeah, so it's basically very awkward for white here, and maybe sometimes they'll push for g4, but don't hop it back. Just go for the trade. Just trade this awkward knight away, and yeah, I mean, game goes on. And this g4 weakness, although a3 push and maybe king h2, but the white's king side is sometimes weak and it would lead to some attacks. So after bishop d7, another move that would be very you would meet is a kind of a sideline a3, which in this case I would go knight g7, just stick with my plan, and maybe sometimes they'll push for a strong b4, but this does not really work because this is over expansion. After this b5 push, you could move your knight to the side of the board because this is a very good outpost, and if takes, this is a pass pawn, and you're also targeting this b5 pawn. So people would just play bishop d3, and this a3 move doesn't really make a difference, and it's just preparing for b4 in the later lines. But this line is just almost the same with the last lines, so I wouldn't really talk about it. And so there is the normal variation, which a very simple response with black is just takes. And this also, yeah, here. This also works if the knight would jump to d2. So somewhere you may be wondering why the knight would jump to d2, because if it comes to c3, some players would go for this winnower variation by pinning it, and then sometimes even just taking it to damage the structure. So this also works because this just transposes into the Rubinstein variation. So after this, I would play knight d7, and this prepares for the knight f6 trade, because you don't want to take with the queen, because this queen is very strong in this semi-open file of the d file. So some responses are bishop d3, where you can take and then hop the knight here, and just these lines you have to look for c5 to open up your position. And do not rush for a fianchetto, because this really weakens up your light squares. See? Your light squares, and the queen may sometimes be able to infiltrate into the b7 square. So you do not want to fianchetto that early. You would like to castle first, and then look for a fianchetto bishop. Or sometimes the idea here is bishop d7 and then bishop c6 to also gain this diagonal. So after this, sometimes maybe people would play queen to d3, but this just doesn't work, and this just gives up the bishop here. Because remember, remember this move, queen d5, and trading everything is beneficial, slightly beneficial for black. Another line here would be pinning the knight, which I would just casually unpin it, and some people may play like a bishop, after takes a bishop b5 check, and you would just unblock it. And if bishop takes, knight takes and bishop takes are both fine, but the engine prefers bishop takes because it forces another trade, and this position is fairly equal. Black gets a 4-on-3 on the king side, white gets a 4-on-3 on the queen side. So in the endgame, it might be slightly dynamic, but it really is just equal. And then, yeah, so this position, it's just, there's nothing special. And then let's talk about some sidelines. So I want you to remember, like, f3 doesn't work because of takes, and queen check. And this is awkward. And then there is a, bishop d3 line, where you could just take, and then you get a free development here. And there still sidelines here. Like, yeah, I think this is it. This is it for the French defense. So some key points and to a conclusion here. French defense, always look for the c5 pawn break for the advanced variation. Exchange variation, you could play the copycat for a draw, or you could play c5 for a more dynamic position. And talking back to the advanced, remember the knight always goes to e7. This g8 knight always goes to e7. And then look for some knight g6 and knight f5 hops. And after your bishop goes to e7, you can look for some f6 break if your knight is on g6. And then this bishop belongs to this d7 diagonal. And then for knight d2 and knight c3, just go take, and remember this knight d7 move to trade the knight off like this. So this is my own opinion and how I play for the French defense. I've played it for 2 to 3 years, got some tournament experience, and I personally really like the French defense as an intermediate player, and I really hope that you would also like the French defense and like this chess content, and you would learn more about the French defense later. I hope you enjoyed this video, guys. Remember to like and subscribe for more chess content. Bye.